トビデオ
On November 20th, 1886, Arthur Conan Doyle, a 27-year-old general practice doctor in Portsmouth, England, published his first novel. A graduate of the University of Edinburgh Medical School, Doyle had taken up writing as a hobby to pass the time between his classes in medicine and botany. He published his first piece, The Mystery of the Sasasa Valley, in the Chambers Edinburgh Journal on September 6, 1879. After spending some time as a ship surgeon on both Greenland and off the coast of West Africa, Doyle completed his Doctor of Medicine degree and moved to Plymouth to set up a medical practice with a fellow classmate. The relationship fell apart, however, and Doyle soon left for Portsmouth to set up his own practice. Business was slow, and Doyle soon turned back to writing stories while he waited for patients. One of the stories was a novel he wrote in 3 weeks. Titled A Study in Scarlet, the story centers around John Watson, an Afghan war veteran who, looking for a place to live before his pension runs out, takes up residence at a flat on 221B Baker Street. It is there he meets his flatmate, an odd, eccentric consulting detective by the name of Sherlock Holmes. While he was not the first fictional detective, Sherlock Holmes is easily the most famous. Partially modeled after a former university professor of Doyle's by the name of Joseph Bell, whom Doyle said it was because of his habit of making the most broad conclusions from the most minute of details, and who would later become a pioneer in the then unknown field of forensic science, Holmes was a hugely memorable character for his powerful skills of deduction, underscoring his various idiosyncrasies. A Study in Scarlet was an immediate hit amongst literary critics and the public alike, so much so that a sequel was commissioned almost immediately. Sherlock Holmes and Watson's exploits were hugely popular, making Arthur Conan Doyle one of the best paid authors of his time. He was so popular that Doyle's attempt at killing off the character in 1893 just so he could write other books backfired, and the public outcry led to Holmes making a comeback in what might be his most famous story yet with The Hound of the Baskervilles. Between 1886 and 1927, Sherlock Holmes starred in 4 novels and 56 short stories. Even after Doyle, now known as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, passed away in 1930, his legacy lives on through Sherlock. There have been thousands of adaptations, interpretations, reimaginings, and parodies of Doyle's detective, all of which cross mediums and borders to make the character known the world over. So it would stand to reason that the Japanese animation industry would eventually get their chance to put their spin on the most famous detective in literature one of these days. And they did. Sherlock Holmes, or Hound depending on which version you are watching, is a quirky amateur chemist, mechanic, and most famously, master detective.
ところで、合鍵はいつもの場所にあったわけですね。
それはもう間違いありません。
ということは。やはりこじ開けた跡がある。
Stoic, intelligent, and a bit on the sarcastic side, Holmes resides at a lovely little boarding house on 221B Baker Street, a place he shares with 2 very important people in his life. One being his flatmate, field assistant, and best friend Watson.
知らないなんて珍しいな。彼ね、私の親友なんだ。どんな難解な事件だって、まずは彼の手にかかっちゃひとたまりもないんだよ。
The other being his landlady, the lovely, kind, and always helpful Mrs. Hudson. It is here where Holmes operates his primary business as a consulting detective, welcoming clients at all hours of the day and taking their requested case. Whether it be helping a young girl find her missing father, escorting a shipment of cash across the country, or recovering a stolen submarine for the Royal Navy. Sometimes he'll be accompanied by his ally and sometimes rival, Inspector Lestrade. Well-meaning but ultimately hot-headed and reckless, Lestrade often ends up as the butt of many a joke in trying to pursue and arrest the suspect. Whatever the case is, the perpetrator of the crimes will usually be Holmes's arch-nemesis, Professor Moriarty, a self-proclaimed criminal mastermind with delusions of grandeur who desires to get rich through a series of incredibly complex and peculiar schemes. Schemes that only Holmes himself can see through, and which always seem to fail thanks to Moriarty's short-sightedness, bad luck, or the failings of his two bumbling henchmen, Smiley and Todd.
私の頭は世界一見破る者は一人も。いや、一人いるかもしれんな。もしかしてホームズちゃんのことをおっしゃってるんですか？そう怖いんでしょ。うるさいんだよ。
Sherlock Hound, or as it's known in its country of origin, Metante Holmeso, literally Great Detective Holmes, first aired on November 6, 1984. It completed its run on May 21st, 1985, with 26 episodes under its belt, running both on Japan's TV Asahi and Italy's Rai 1 network. Now wait, you might ask, why did this anime run on two different networks in two different countries around the same time? Wasn't this before simulcasting became a thing, or even before the anime boom itself became a thing? Sherlock Hound's existence is part of an often downplayed part of anime history, one that we'll be spending a lot of time talking about today, alongside getting into the anime itself and why I think it's one of my personal favorites of the 1980s. Now, to answer that question about Sherlock Hound airing in other countries aside from Japan at the time of its release, when we talk about the anime boom, we are usually talking about the American anime boom. In other countries apart from America, they got anime a lot earlier than we did in the States. Countries in Europe, Latin America, and the Middle East had Japanese anime exported to them much earlier and in far more quantities than they did in America. Anime played a huge role in the lives of children growing up in those regions, so much so that it's the reason why a lot of future animated productions that came from those regions would wear the anime influence on their sleeves. In Europe though, anime had become so ubiquitous that co-productions were inevitable. These types of productions between European countries and Japanese animation studios began sometime around the early 70s and were common until the early 90s. While these productions were usually funded first and foremost by companies in countries such as France, Spain, and Finland, they still fall under the anime umbrella, creating a subgenre of anime I like to call Euro anime. Euro anime are defined not just by the fact that European companies had a hand in developing them, but also by the fact that they were made with a European audience in mind. Even though these titles would also air in Japan, they really stood out by how distinct they were from other titles produced entirely in Japan. Setting, character designs, and even overall plots seen in Euro anime reflect a far more Western feel, utilizing themes and references that resonate more with European audiences rather than a Japanese one. But when you look at how the shows handle their cinematography and animation, they more resemble the shows coming out of Japan rather than their homelands. One of the first true Euro anime titles was an Italian-Japanese title called Calimero. The sole black chick of a family of yellow ones who still wears half his eggshell on his head, Calimero was the creation of two brothers, Tony and Nino Pagot. These two brothers were considered pioneers in the field of Italian animation and comics, having created the first Italian feature-length animated film, The Dynamite Brothers, in 1949. But the brothers struck gold in 1963 with the creation of Calimero, who made his debut on the sketch comedy advertising show Carosello.
Stupidi! Cosa dici? Abbiamo visto come lei tratta quelli vestiti male e allora siamo corsi a casa a cambiarci. Così lei ci fa pagare poche tasse. Ah, allora volevate farmela anche voi!
Calimero was an immediate sensation, both as a character and as a merchandising icon. He was the mascot for many a soap product, whose ads showed that the chick was not actually black, but just very dirty. After a couple of years on Carosello, Italia's national public broadcasting company, Radio Televisione Italiana, or RAI for short, decided to license Calimero to Japan for an anime. Collaborating with Toei Animation, the eponymous anime debuted on October 15, 1972, and ran until September 30th, 1975.
Is it possible nobody wants to play with me? Yeah, I understand. They're big and I'm little. But it's an injustice, it is.
But at the turn of the 80s, the anime boom of Europe was in full swing, and RAI needed a show that could compete with the type of co-productions Spain and France were funding at the time. Ultimately, they decided to team up with a studio that they knew would bring them a surefire hit. Our good old friends down at Tokyo Movie Shinsha. When you think about it, TMS were the perfect studio for the job. Not only was their flagship franchise Lupin III insanely popular in Italy, but they were also responsible for the French-Japanese mega hit that was currently sweeping Europe at the time, Ulysses 31. We don't know how exactly the idea of Sherlock Hound came to be, but it's kinda easy to draw some conclusions. For one thing, taking established pieces of Western literature and putting a brand new twist on them were the standard model for Euro anime at the time, and we also can't rule out the fact that maybe Rai wanted to directly compete with BRB International and Nippon Animation show that was about to come out at the time, Dogtanian and the Three Muskehounds. Yeah, Sherlock Hound wasn't even the first show to take a canine approach to literary figures. So Rai pitched the project to TMS, who assigned it to their subsidiary, Telecom Animation Film. Heading up the project would be a seasoned animator who had just made his directorial debut with the classic Lupin III film, The Castle of Cagliostro, a guy by the name of Hayao Miyazaki. Perhaps you've heard of him. If Sherlock Hound is known for anything, it's the involvement of Miyazaki. It gets treated as kind of a footnote in his legacy because it happened before Ghibli proper was founded, but people need to remember that Miyazaki had been working in the industry for almost 20 years at that point. Sherlock Hound was the last TV anime he was involved with before devoting himself entirely to feature-length productions. Miyazaki was not unknown in the European world. His contributions to the popular imported titles that he did during his time at Nippon Animation in the 70s made him a huge get for Rai. But Miyazaki wasn't going to be conceiving the series alone. While the Pagot brothers were no longer in animation, Nino having died in 1972 and Tony having shifted his focus to writing comic books, Nino's adult children, Marco and Guy, had just begun their careers as animators and were more than willing to help Miyazaki in conceiving the world and characters for Sherlock Hound. Miyazaki befriended the both of them during production and would later honor them by naming two main characters of his 1992 film Porco Rosso after them. With the creatives and a staff of TMS's finest animators established, production on Sherlock Hound began in earnest on April of 1981. However, after 4 episodes were in the can and 2 were still being made, production came to an abrupt halt. Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's estate, run by his wealthy and extremely litigious heirs, blocked production over numerous rights issues that we don't even really know the exact details of. Whatever they were, by the time they got sorted out, Miyazaki was no longer working at TMS. He had left the studio around 1982 to pursue a passion project at another studio called Topcraft that would inevitably become Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind and would later lead to the founding of Studio Ghibli. TMS was reluctant to continue production without Miyazaki. Miyazaki, not wanting the work of his animation team to go to waste, allowed 2 episodes of Sherlock Hound to be shown alongside Nausicaa, The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle, and Treasure Under the Sea. Almost immediately, these episodes got a positive response from Japanese audiences. This convinced TMS to resume production, now with Kyosuke Mikuriya at the helm. While not as well known as Miyazaki, Mikuriya had directed most of the episodes on Lupin III Part 2, so he was still up to the task. Production on Sherlock Hound resumed almost immediately, and all 20 remaining episodes of its 26-episode order were completed just in time for its November premiere. Sherlock Hound was immensely popular, not just in Japan, but all over Europe and other countries. Strangely, the only country where it actually bombed was, of all countries, Italy. Rai, despite pitching the idea in the first place, decided to give their show a disastrous programming schedule where every episode was split into 4 5-minute parts a la Danger Mouse. This idiotic decision made it take 4 days to see the end of a completed episode, and thus made the series go by completely unnoticed. Rai tried again a few years later, this time airing the episodes in full like they should have done in the first place, but this attempt failed as well thanks to the network barely advertising the broadcast. Marco and G. Pagot continued to work in animation, doing more Euro anime titles with TMS, and would even revisit the Sherlock Hound style of anime with Montana Jones, just replace Sherlock Holmes with Indiana Jones, and replace the World of Dogs with a World of Jungle Cats. So after that very, very long history, we must ask ourselves, what about the show itself? Now, I can say without any hyperbole that the animation of Sherlock Hound is exceptional. This is, quite possibly, the best animation you'll see on a TV anime that came out in the 1980s. And obviously, this is due to Miyazaki and his staff of gifted animators and artists. Watch any of the episodes that Miyazaki directed, and you'll see the work of the people who made Ghibli what it is today. You have Yasuo Otsuka, Miyazaki's own mentor, whose talent at animating complex vehicles and machinery allows for a mastery of the most elaborate set pieces seen in the anime. Makiko Futaki, one of Miyazaki's most gifted pupils whose intricate character animations gives her scenes an organic feel to them. Masako Shinohara, a very versatile animator who has a knack for both dramatic blocking as well as comedic squash and stretch style character animation. Atsuko Tanaka, a future Ghibli veteran who is an expert at smoothly animated and exciting action set pieces that appear to be straight out of a feature-length film. It even extends to staff members who didn't even go to Ghibli, such as Kazuhide Tomonga, one of the most extraordinary animators in the business whose accomplishments are vast and many. The way he animates certain scenes makes the fact that he did it all on a TV budget nothing short of a feat of greatness. But Mikuriya's team shouldn't be counted out though. While you know the animation is not going to be as good as Miyazaki's team of luminaries, there is still a noticeable amount of talent to be seen. Specifically the work by animator Tatsuo Yanagino. His style of animation is very wacky, cartoony, and heavy on the smears, and it's such a perfect fit for what is essentially a lighthearted episodic adventure anime. However, there is still a remarkable difference between the two directors, and comparing the two, you can't feel like there is an element missing from Mikuriya's episode. It's not his fault, but there is a reason why Miyazaki and his crew are considered some of the best of the best. It's getting a ribeye steak for nearly every dinner, but every now and then you'll get filet mignon. There's nothing wrong with the ribeye, and in fact the ribeye is still pretty damn tasty, but you still kinda wish you could get filet mignon for every meal. Being an adaptation of Sherlock Holmes that's designed for a younger audience, there was bound to be some changes to the cast of characters. Sherlock is still very much the archetypical Sherlock. Cool-headed, analytic, hyper-observant.
これはペンキです。
ペンキどういうことかな。
もしかするというと、すり替えたロブスターを小箱に入れてこの窓から。
But they definitely file down a lot of his more unsavory characteristics from the books, such as his drug use and his distrust of women, and the result is a warmer, much kinder interpretation of the detective.
ホームズさん、
なんだい？
スリの子嫌い。
ポリーの部屋を見て僕にはすぐ分かった。この子は本当はいい子なんだってね。おやすみ。
おやすみ。
Watson is still the archetypical everyman, albeit one who has his bumbling nature dialed up a notch.
青虫
But at the same time, he is never a liability to Holmes, and the series does go out of its way to show that Watson can do things that Holmes cannot.
だいぶ心臓が弱ってますが、まあ大丈夫でしょう。
Inspector Lestrade, meanwhile, is definitely played up for more laughs.
そろそろいいだろう。それ
While in the novels he was portrayed as an unimaginative yet competent rival detective to Holmes, here he is just a full-blown Zenigata clone, designed to be the one who chases Moriarty and his goons off into the sunset every episode alongside his roving mob of Keystone cops.
はいや、乗り込い
Moriarty is obviously very different from his literary counterpart. In the books, he was a humble, soft-spoken professor who tried to keep his criminal dealings under wraps. Here, he is the leader of his own wacky Team Rocket trio, whose addiction to needlessly complicated schemes and desire to best Holmes in the battle of the wits proves to be his undoing more than once.
ホームズがバレたんですよ、きっと。もうやめますか。こんなところ負けが込んでるし。わしの計画は完璧のはずだ。ホームズめ。
He's barely a threat as is, and Holmes just seems to treat him more as a nuisance than an actual nemesis. In fact, it almost seems like Holmes enjoys these games with Moriarty, if only because he knows he can politely screw with him.
そう素晴らしい知恵と行動力の持ち主としか分かりませんね。
もしやモリアーティ教授では。
いやとんでもない。彼程度の知恵ではとても不可能です。
But the character who got the biggest change from the original source material is Mrs. Hudson. A far cry from being Holmes's elderly, long-suffering landlady,
Tea, Mr. Holmes.
Is it poisoned, Nanny?
Mrs. Hudson is instead portrayed as a young, generous widow who enjoys Holmes and Watson's company.
いやどうも。
ずいぶん素敵な匂いですこと。
何々アンモニアから香水を作ろうと思いましてね。
かわいそうなワトソンさん。
Being the sole regular female character in a cast of men, Miyazaki wanted her to have a more active role, joining Holmes and Watson on their journeys and even implying that she might be more perceptive than Holmes in some cases. But Rai pushed back, wanting her to reflect the more traditional Mrs. Hudson of the original stories. While she still retains her youth and the overall pluckiness that Miyazaki wanted, she nevertheless feels restricted in her role. She rarely if ever ventures outside of Baker Street, and unless the episode involves her or her past as a pilot, she barely seems to be given anything to do. It just feels like her role for most of the series is just to serve Holmes and Watson tea and fret about how they're gonna miss dinner again.
電報です。
残念だわ。今夜はワトソンさんの好きなカレー料理だったのに、それにホームズさんまで。
And that sucks because watching Miyazaki's episodes, it was obvious that he had a lot more planned for her. Even with the restriction given to him by Rai, he knew how to work within those parameters and make Mrs. Hudson a very capable character. Someone who always has a good handle on things, whether she's a hostage taken by Moriarty, or someone who's determined to save the life of a pilot in a plane crash. Plus, she's just so adorable, with those beautiful blue eyes, her thick blonde locks, and that warm, helpful smile, and wow, Queen, you are so beautiful. Moving on. The show is episodic and follows a very strict formula. Something valuable goes missing, Holmes takes the case, Holmes finds out that Moriarty is involved, there's a big climactic fight/chase scene, Holmes gets the valuable thing back while Moriarty and his thugs run off to lick their wounds and thieve another day. It's a strict case of the week formula where everything follows a rigid status quo. Holmes and Watson always solve the case, Moriarty always loses the valuables, and Inspector Lestrade never catches and arrests Moriarty. They all dance the same dance in every episode, and they'll be back to do it again next time. But for an anime centered around one of the world's most famous detectives whose stories codified the modern mystery genre, the amount of time they spend on the mystery aspect is shockingly low. Usually, if a mystery is presented to us, it's either solved by the commercial break, or the audience is given the answer at the start of the episode, and we just have to wait until the point where Holmes and Moriarty finally meet. And it's not like there's much in the way of a mystery to be solved because the culprit is going to be Moriarty every time.
How did you know it was me?
It's always you.
And it always will be!
If there is a criticism that can be leveled against Miyazaki's episodes, is that he appears to be not at all interested in the Holmesian aspects of Sherlock Hound. The setting of Sherlock Hound is very much his own version of Victorian England, one that's full of steampunk technology, runabouts, zeppelins, U-boats, biplanes, and other fantastical machinery that help the setting serve as a vehicle for literal high-flying adventures. Mikuriya's episodes, on the other hand, still keep a lot of the mystery elements intact. They are still adventure stories at heart, but the plot is usually set up with, we know Moriarty and his goons did this, but how exactly did they do this? Let's compare two episodes. On Miyazaki's side, we have Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. The main plot of this is that a young pickpocket named Polly has stolen a rare gem that Moriarty nicked in a heist, and Holmes and Watson take it upon themselves to protect her before she returns it to the rightful owners. It's a great episode, but one that, aside from some character names, lacks any signifiers that it is a Sherlock Holmes story. Holmes doesn't even do any serious deduction in it. Change a couple of characters' names and it's basically a Ghibli short film. Compare this to Mikuriya's The Speckled Band. Not only is it a bowdlerized version of an actual Sherlock Holmes story, but the tone of that episode is the polar opposite of the Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle. While that episode was a glorious adventure tale spanning all across the streets of London, The Speckled Band is a gothic locked room mystery that takes place entirely in a spooky Scooby-Doo mansion. I'm not saying that high-flying adventure wasn't all Miyazaki wanted to do with Sherlock Hound. If you look at the concept art, you can see that he and the Pogo brothers imagined a far more true to form Sherlock, one that still retains the fun-loving Lupin-esque atmosphere of the series we got, but also one that has a darker and far more appropriately gothic atmosphere. Now obviously Rai was not going to let him produce a show for kids that dark, so Miyazaki obviously had to dial it back, and that's ultimately what led him to use this world he made to experiment with set pieces and concepts he would apply to his later Ghibli works. But he did it all in such a creative way that you barely care if you were watching a mystery show or not. Miyazaki's episodes were always the most exciting for a reason. Not trying to put down Mikuriya's work on the show, he also gets creative and does some very exciting episodes. But when watching a lot of these episodes in bulk like I did, it does feel like the show gets a lot more formulaic the further away it gets from episodes Miyazaki worked on. But in spite of any critique I have towards Sherlock Hound, I ultimately enjoy it. It's second only to Dirty Pair in terms of great episodic 80s anime. But some episodes are obviously better than others. Episodes like the disappearance of the splendid royal horse, which has Moriarty framed by a phantom thief XP, and the adventures of the three students, where Holmes has to solve a mystery behind an art forgery, are episodes where I don't feel like their premises are used to their full potential. But at the same time, they didn't bore me, and I still enjoyed them for what they were. So I think the best thing I can do right here is to give you a list of what I think are the best episodes of Sherlock Hound. A small client. Holmes suspects Moriarty might be behind a rush of counterfeit money entering the market, but has no leads to go on. That is until a little girl comes by and asks Holmes if he can help her find her father. A good starting point for new viewers who don't care about watching the episodes in order. It's also the Miyazaki episode where Holmes actually does the most sleuthing. The Adventure of the Blue Carbuncle already summed up the plot a few paragraphs ago, but it should be known that this is the best animated out of all the episodes. There is a reason why a lot of the clips I've used are from this episode. Mrs. Hudson is taken hostage. Moriarty kidnaps Mrs. Hudson to use as a bargaining chip, but things don't exactly go as planned. Really showcases why Mrs. Hudson isn't a typical damsel in distress, as she is nearly in complete control of the situation thanks to her ability to weaponize kindness and courtesy. Also, has one of the best executed misleads I've ever seen in an anime. The White Cliffs of Dover, another episode focused on Mrs. Hudson, one that focuses on her past and her late husband, and also shows that she's capable in more ways than just being a polite, friendly face. It's second only to Blue Carbuncle in terms of animation, and it will make you sad that Miyazaki wasn't allowed to use Mrs. Hudson more. The Sovereign Gold Coins. Holmes and Watson investigate the disappearance of 20 coins from a specialized safe owned by a greedy industrialist. Probably the only episode of the series that utilizes Miyazaki's penchant for Marxist themes. Treasure Under the Sea. Holmes and Watson are tasked by the Royal Navy to recover a submarine stolen by Moriarty. Another example of great animation, and also is the episode where Holmes and Watson come the closest to biting it. I realize I just named all the episodes Miyazaki did. So, I guess I better balance things out with some recommended episodes of Mikuriya's. The Speckled Band, the only episode based off an existing Sherlock Holmes story, surprisingly very spooky and has a gloomy gothic atmosphere that doesn't appear to be undercut by all the goofy goings-on throughout the episode. The Crown of Mazzelin, Holmes is tasked with proving the innocence of an aristocrat's son after he's accused of stealing a crown on loan from the Queen. The first canon encounter between Holmes and Moriarty, and one that ends in a very exciting and well choreographed boat chase. The Green Balloon. Holmes attempts to solve a mystery behind a green balloon that falls in his garden with an SOS message attached. Has a plot that's full of genuine tension that's balanced out with some great comedic character animation. The Secret of the Sacred Cross Sword. Holmes and Watson try to figure out the mystery as to why a safe containing a mysterious artifact was broken into, but the artifact ultimately left untouched. Good balance between mystery and Indiana Jones style adventure. Also has a kid sidekick who, while not as good as Polly, is actually very useful to the mission and not an annoying liability. The Rosetta Stone. Holmes has to solve the mystery of how the literal Rosetta Stone floated away from the British Museum one night. This is the episode that feels the most Lupin III, especially when it comes to the animation. It even has a character who is just a dog version of Goemon Ishikawa. Disturbance, the World Flight Championship, a wacky racist style episode where Holmes has to stop Moriarty from winning a prestigious plane race, notable for being the rare episode where Mrs. Hudson comes along with Holmes and Watson, and she gets to wear her adorable pilot's uniform. So all in all, Sherlock Hound is just a good, clean, fun anime. Yes, there is a noticeable gap in quality between the Miyazaki and Mikuriya episodes, and there is a feeling throughout that the anime is being hampered by outside interference that kept a great anime from being an exceptional anime, but despite everything, it's still a great anime. When you watch an anime like Sherlock Hound, you are watching animation history unfold right before your very eyes. You are seeing talented animators with decades of experience under their belts hone their craft and master a style that would, in just a few years, be transferred into one of the most legendary animation studios on the planet. So legendary that not even Disney can touch them. And even after those people went off to Topcraft after production was shelved for a year and a half, it's not like the show got worse. This is TMS we're talking about. High quality TV animation is their forte. Take the worst animated episode of Sherlock Hound and put it up against the best animated episode of He-Man, and it would be like comparing a Silly Symphonies cartoon to a cave painting. To me, Sherlock Hound is beautiful, well-animated fun, and easily accessible to everyone, even people who don't particularly care for anime. It's a hearty recommend for anyone who wants to watch something that's exciting, funny, and in a way, warm and comforting. It certainly is something that's more than a bullet point on a bunch of legendary animators' resumes.